They're joining. April, Anthony, Nick, Ken. Hi, I'm Ben. Pleasure to meet you. I'll give a quick rundown, not as in depth as my first video. So I'm currently a realtor with Keller Williams Cervenic Realty with the fancy background. I am also a property manager. I run our property management division for Trumbull and Mahoning County. With our Keller Williams Cervenic property management, we have 8 property managers, 5 or 6 full-time administration staff, and currently just got announced this month that we broke over 700 units that we actively manage at this time. I think the last time I gave a talk, I was right around 15 or 20 rental units that I cover. I'm now up to 56. So my primary business, even though I'm on the realtor end of it, is investment real estate. About 90% of the people that I work with are investors from all different levels of just starting out, looking for their very first investment rental property, all the way up to the gentleman that I was working with today works and buys everywhere from 15 to 25 unit apartment complexes, industrial buildings, commercial real estate, all throughout. So I'm looking at the chat. Is that the link for the last video?
Yeah, I put our YouTube channel on there, and you can find his video on our YouTube channel.
Perfect. Working in the background. I like it.
That's great.
So the first one was just the first video was just covering the different types of real estate investment. This one, the topic tonight is how to negotiate. So in negotiation, it's going to be pretty straightforward. There are a lot of laws and regulations in Ohio when it comes to dealing with real estate transactions that kind of dictate what can and can't be done. So it is pretty straightforward. Will be a little shorter than the first video. But basically what I want to do is kind of give a quick layout of what happens in a real estate transaction, and then what the negotiating points are from both the buyer and the seller side. So first, my very first piece of advice, and I'm patting myself on the back a little bit here, is the best way to negotiate in a real estate transaction is to have somebody do it for you. So that is where an agent comes in. It is literally our job to know the different varying tactics, what can and can't be done, and ensure that a real estate transaction is legally binding and can move forward and close from beginning to end. With that being said, this video is going to be very informational for 2 reasons. One, if you just want to be able to understand what your real estate agent is doing for you in the future, or be able to tell if they are doing what they should be, or if you may need to find a different agent, or if you are looking at getting into real estate investing and representing yourself in the transaction of buying and selling, there are going to be some very big points, because there are some different items that you may come across that you don't see very often, but when they do come up, they're important to know what they are, because they can drastically affect the way a real estate sale is completed. So the first item, sorry, I just dropped my phone. What I'm going to do is just go through kind of a traditional real estate, and when I say traditional, it makes up probably about 75 to 80% of the real estate transactions. When you go to buy your first home or a regular just residential house that you're going to live in, this is traditionally just about how every single transaction is going to go. I do have our purchase agreement pulled up on my other screen. Unfortunately, I can't share that because it is a Keller Williams document, but I'm basically just going to kind of read from top to bottom and start in what the negotiating points are. The first one is, the first lesson is, anywhere that there is a blank or an empty space in a purchase agreement is negotiable. And one thing that people often don't realize is that really any point of a purchase agreement is negotiable. In order for a purchase contract to be legally binding, both parties have to sign off and agree to it. So in order for that to happen, Both parties have to agree, which means that both parties have the ability to negotiate. So just kind of a first general overview. Obviously, the first thing you're going to see on any purchase agreement is going to detail, the first paragraph is going to be the information: who owns the house, who's buying the house, what's the property address, what's the county parcel number, to just legally identify what is being purchased in that transaction. But it doesn't take long for you. Actually, line 4 in our agreement is the very first negotiating tactic, and that is the purchase price. This one is pretty straightforward, obviously, how much it's buying for. It's the number one negotiated thing in any sales negotiation, whether it's real estate, buying a car, a garage sale with grandma if you don't want to spend $20 on those golf clubs. That is always the go-to. It's going to be the purchase price, and that is trying to find a compromise between the buyer and seller in what both parties think the value of the property is worth, how much the buyer is willing to pay compared to how much the seller is willing to let it go for. The next item is, does anybody have any questions on purchase price? I know that's pretty straightforward. It's what you're buying and selling for. It's where the big bucks come in. The next item is called the earnest money deposit. So what the earnest money deposit is, in a real estate transaction, an earnest money deposit is a financial deposit that's made by the buyer, generally to either their represented brokerage, or it can go directly to the title company as well, that gives the buyer a financial interest in the property. Very, very simple way to explain it is, think of Kmart or Walmart layaway. Oh, I just said Kmart. Did I show my age a little bit? But you put a very small fraction, it goes towards the purchase of the property. But in doing so, and when I say a very small amount, it's a $100,000 house, your earnest money deposit could be $500. So basically it says, hey, I have $500 invested in this property. That means the seller cannot conduct showings. They can't even receive other offers. They can't even look at them. They can't talk to anybody about them. It is, at that point, it is a two-party transaction. So that is very important, and obviously that is a negotiating point, because in a way a seller looks at it, and sometimes with listing agents, is the more money you're willing to put down in earnest money is a determination of how serious you are about purchasing it. So you may actually see some instances where you settle on a purchase price, and then the seller counters back requesting or demanding that they aren't going to agree to it unless you're willing to put more money up front to give you more of a financial investment into the property to prove that you are serious about purchasing their property. It doesn't happen often, but when it does, that's where it is. And where the earnest money factors into it as well is once the contingencies at a certain point in the actual purchasing process. So if you put the earnest money down on a property, if you were to decide early on that you didn't want the property, or you did a home inspection and found out there was a major issue that you and the seller didn't know about, it wasn't in the disclosures, something comes up that makes you realize you don't want this house or property anymore, and you release the transaction, at the beginning, more often than not, 9 times out of 10, the money will actually go back to the buyer. It's yours. It wasn't a solid contract. But after a certain point, generally when the one of two contingencies or both are filled, when the home inspection is completed and the buyer signs off saying that, yes, I looked at the home inspection, everything's fine, I want to buy the house. And then the appraisal is conducted and the bank comes back and says, hey, the house appraised, we've approved this loan. Once those two things are done, where it's like, hey, the house is good, the financing is good, you just decided you don't want the house anymore, or you were on Zillow laying in bed last night and found one you think you might like more and now you want out, then that money can go back to, that money would actually go back to the seller more often than not. So as small as it is, and thinking just a tiny deposit, that is a negotiating point, because it could determine you could end up losing $2,000–3,000 on a house that you're not buying because something came up and you decided you just didn't want it anymore. So it is a contention point between buyers and sellers. And when you're on the flip side of that as a seller, understand that as well, that the more money they put in, if for some reason they decide they change their mind, you at least have some kind of backing or repayment for the time that your property was off the market. Going from there, the very next part of our purchase contract immediately goes into financing. So believe it or not, financing can factor in to negotiations, and in as bad as it is to say, just a simple fact, especially in the market we have today that is so very competitive, financing is a major factor into it. On the buying end of it, when doing all of your negotiations, you obviously want to get the property for the best price you possibly can. That is obviously the goal. One way to accomplish that is by trying to make the sale as easy as possible on the seller. So with the type of financing, obviously you have the cash is the go-to. Cash is king. It's easy, it's clean. There's no third-party involvement or banking. Easiest way to go. But not a lot of people have hundreds of thousands of dollars sitting around in their checking account that they can just pay that. So the next easiest and the seller's viewpoint is going to be a conventional style loan. So this is a normal traditional mortgage that you see with a 5 to 10% down payment. Really just factors in on the bank approving the value of the home and the financing payment for you. Now there are some other financing options that come into buyers to help them if they may not necessarily have 5 or 10% down, or in special circumstances of buying a property. For example, if they're a first-time home buyer, military veteran, or USDA, which is for agricultural farmland. These type of financing, they are great options for buyers. They offer lower down payments, oftentimes have decently better interest rates, and they're very helpful to help people get into properties. They offset that by having a third-party hand in evaluating the property with a little more of an in-depth appraisal. And with the FHA and VA loan, part of that is during the appraisal, the bank will also have a inspection done on them for themselves, not just your general home inspection that's for you as the buyer, but they will have a appraisal and inspection and can come back and actually put conditions on the sale that state our inspector decided that items 1, 2, 3, and 4 are not correct or safe in this property, and we will not approve your loan until the seller pays for those to be repaired before you buy it. Great protection from a buyer. A lot of times sellers are more than willing to do so, but it can become a big contention point and can actually cause deals to fall apart in the event a seller is not willing to pay those costs, because for them to happen prior to closing, the seller has to pay for those out of pocket. It can't just be taken out of the purchase of the property, as with a conventional loan where you can put repair funds into escrow. They can be completed after ownership has been transferred. With FHA and VA, they have to be done before closing. So as tough as it is as a buyer and having this conversation, sometimes having a 3% down payment instead of a 5% down payment seems absolutely awesome, and it really can be, but it can be a contention point, especially in a situation when you get into multiple offers, or you're not just negotiating with the seller, but you're fighting against other buyers. The type of financing and how hard it's going to be for a seller to get the transaction done is going to factor in whether we want to admit it or not. It's a fact of life. If you can look at cash or conventional where they don't ask anything of the seller is going to look at that compared to, well, how much money could I be spending in repairs that I wouldn't have to if they didn't have this kind of financing. It stinks, but it just is the way it is. And it's something that does have to be negotiated, and an agent needs to be very well aware of. And hopefully, if you do work with an agent and you explain their type of financing that you will be using, they can walk you through exactly how that's going to factor into your deal. Now, with that being said, probably the most important thing that I can give you in terms of financing and negotiating is get pre-approved if you can. Again, this factors into step 1 of making the seller's life easier, in that I will say the very first line of the financing section in our purchase contract is that buyers shall use all reasonable efforts to obtain the loan and shall make a written loan application within blank. If you're pre-approved, you've already started that process, and that really can put a seller's mind at ease. Being able to show that proof of funds or pre-approval, and look, we've already got the ball rolling. We are serious about this. We know that our financing, let me take a step back. That's actually a big part too when it comes to financing of a property and using a bank. There are actually two sides. There you being approved by the bank and what they believe you will be able to afford or bring on in monthly bills or keep your debt to income ratio that you're going to be okay with. Two, the second part of that is actually getting the property approved, which is where the additional inspections for FHA and VA come in. But with the pre-approval, basically you're stepping in and saying, hey, 50% of the unknowns in a closing are already taken care of. I'm pre-approved. I already know we're good to go. All we need to do is make sure that the property, what we're buying this property for, is what the bank thinks the property is worth. That really puts the seller's mind at ease. It's going to give you an upper hand, especially in a multiple offer situation. If you're looking at, as a seller, on the flip side of that, if you're looking at multiple offers, you have 5, 6, 7 offers in front of you, 2 or 3 of them, it has come up, may even be for less. Say $100,000 listing, you have somebody offered 105, but they're not pre-approved, and you have somebody offered 97 that are pre-approved. That's actually going to put them about neck and neck, because it's, well, if we take the 105, what are the chances they don't get approved for the loan? They haven't even called a bank. They don't even know if they can afford this or not. Whereas at the 97, they've already seen the pre-approval. They know what they can afford. They know it's within their price range, and now you're just looking at the house itself. Pre-approvals can go a long, long way in negotiations. So I know I've been rambling for a little bit now. Does anybody happen to have any questions with what I've covered so far? No? Okay. No, there you go. Thank you, Ken. So the financing is going to be the biggest part. Obviously, the money when it comes to buying and selling, the purchase price and how you're going to pay for it are the end all to be all. They're the kick to get the ball rolling down the hill. They're also going to be the most contention points. That's where 90% of the negotiations are going to occur. Some other items that you're going to have that are going to come up is in escrow. You have to pick a title company. There are tons and tons of title companies all over Ohio and throughout the country. Really, it's going to depend on their pricing of closing costs, and I highly recommend as a buyer to do your research or even talk to your agent if you do have one and ask them for 3 or 4 recommendations in title companies. Even if you're not entirely sure what property you're willing to purchase or you're ready to write an offer yet, calling those and getting a preemptive jump on them to get a rough idea of how much title insurance is going to cost, title search fees, filing fees, what the closing costs for the title company are. Those are all additional costs, and they all vary from title company to title company. Next is pretty simple. At that point, you've figured out how much you're buying the property for, how the buyer is going to pay for it, who is going to ensure that all the paperwork is filed correctly and that the house can actually be purchased. That's what part of what a title company does in a law firm is they will do research on the title to ensure that a great Aunt Sally wasn't given the house 18 years ago in a will and she never claimed it and you actually don't own it. Believe it or not, that has happened in the past. That's why title companies and title insurance became a thing. But now that you've figured it out, property's ready to go. All the major details at that point have been ironed out. The next one is deed and closing. So with that, your negotiation is going to be a closing date. Generally, on a financed property, if a buyer is going to be using financing, that's anywhere from 30 to 45 days. In the last year with the COVID pandemic, we were seeing some that were going 60, 75 days, just simple delays in lack of employees at work, inability to get inspectors or appraisers out to the property in a timely manner, just being short-staffed. We are seeing it return a little bit back, but really kind of the 45 to 50 days where it sits normally now. But it's always best to negotiate and try and shoot for a 30. Obviously, the sellers, the quicker you can close on it, the quicker the sellers are going to be happy because the quicker they're going to have their money. Other than that, so deed and closing usually go hand in hand with possession. Possession is also a negotiating tactic. So more often than not, when you buy a house, you would think, I buy a house, I close on it, the state calls and says, hey, you own this house. The house is now mine. I should get the keys. Usually you'd be right. In buyers and sellers, one thing to pay attention to is possession. So there is actually in a real estate transaction the ability to determine when possession is given after the sale. So there are instances, and sometimes in purchase agreements, if you're not paying attention, you could skip right over this, but there are instances where they say, hey, say for example, you're closing on a house. We're in the middle of closing right now. You just accepted an offer. They want to close on May 31st with a 14-day possession. You think, oh, cool, May 31st, end of the month, awesome. We can take our spring vacation in June. What that actually means with the closing of May 31st with a 14-day possession would mean that the sellers would continue to live in the house for 14 days after you owned it, you took possession of the house. So where this comes up a lot is if in the situation, say a seller may have purchased another house, they have a closing, they can't move into their new house until it closes, so they can't get their stuff out of your house, what is now your house, or they're moving out of town. Something to consider as a seller as well is it being able to use possession if you need a few extra days for moving, or maybe you're having trouble, you're moving clear across the country, it's going to be incredibly expensive to move, and you actually need the money from the sale to pay the moving costs to move out. If you want to make sure as a buyer, especially if you're buying a home for yourself, the last thing you want to do is close on that house, be all excited, have the utilities transferred, the moving company scheduled, your family's coming over for the first dinner to help you move everything, and then find out that you've got to wait 10 days. And nobody told you. When you're looking at real estate, you need to pay attention to not just the day of closing, but when is the day of possession. There's an acronym you can pay attention to if you're ever looking at a real estate transaction or talking to your agent. TOT, which is time of transfer. And all that means is, hey, once the state calls and says my buyer owns this property, you give me the keys right now. We're not waiting. Time of transfer, it's the cleanest, it causes less headaches, but sometimes the sellers do need that extra time. And as a buyer, you need to understand that that could be a possibility. Next to financing, the second biggest item that you're going to be looking at is inspections. Now, I absolutely, with every single buyer that I work with, absolutely recommend that you get a property or a home inspection. Every single purchase you make, I don't care if it's your first house or your 15th and you know what you're looking at, I recommend the inspection. I will forever recommend using inspections. They are great tools to come in with an objective, open, third-party mindset and identify what could be potential, even minor or critical issues with a house that the seller or that you didn't see as a buyer during your showing and that the seller has lived there for 20 years and didn't even know was an issue. That has happened. But it is also a negotiating tactic. It's not only with what type of home inspection. So with a purchase of a home, you have the general home inspection, the septic inspection if it has septic, well inspection if it has a well, radon inspection, mold inspection, wood destroying insect inspection, point of sale inspections. There are about a dozen different types of inspections. It's a negotiating tactic on which ones you would like to have. And more often than not, a seller's not going to argue with which ones you want. They're going to argue with or counter or negotiate with what they're responsible for paying for. Usually in a general home inspection, which is just the general overview of the property, if the buyer wants that, the buyer is going to pay for it. Where you run into that is sometimes with the well or septic. Now, obviously, the buyer is not responsible for the maintenance and upkeep of the septic system. But in this situation where a septic or a well might need to be repaired, the seller may request that you actually pay for the inspection and then they'll pay for the repairs, or splitting the cost 50-50, or they may come right out and say, I'm not paying for any of your inspections. If you want them, you pay for them. Could be a little inconsiderate, sometimes could be considered a little rude. Part of a real estate transaction is to recognize at that point it's not personal. You have to look at it as a business standpoint. This is all about the money in and money out. The seller could simply be in a position where they don't have the $485 to pay for the inspection, and instead of saying that, are just going to tell you no. So where that in the recent past, the last couple of months, inspections have become a very, very high point of negotiation. Generally, it's pretty assumed if you're buying a house, you're getting a home inspection. It's just, are the buyers paying for it, or the sellers paying for it? In the last couple of months, with the lack of inventory and the high competitiveness in buying properties, actually home inspections have become a point of negotiation in terms of there are buyers that are actually saying, you know what, I don't care if there's anything wrong with the property. I don't need an inspection. I just want the house. I personally would never recommend that, but if they're comfortable with it and that's what they decide they want to do, that's fine. Understand, again, in looking at multiple offer situations, the easier you can make the sale, the easier you can make the seller's life, the better chance you have of being the one that gets accepted. And unfortunately, it's gotten to the point where buyers are taking a little more risk and waiving inspections just so they can get an upper hand on somebody who may be offering the exact same offer, exact same price, but they want a home inspection, which is just another what if for the seller. But it is part of your due diligence, and I still highly recommend get the home inspection. Personally, I would even say that if you lose an offer because of wanting a home inspection, then we'll find a better house. But every situation is different. So moving on from that, at that point, really you've gotten 70% of a real estate transaction covered. Banks doing their underwriting, property at that point, property has already been, you've been approved for financing, they've already done the appraisal. You may be waiting on the appraisal, it may have come back and said, hey, we're good, we're getting the paperwork taken care of. Your title company is then going to be looking at the loss history report, looking at the title, confirming everything's good, collecting all the documents from both the bank, the buyer, the seller, and the agents. The next one that you're going to be discussing in a purchase offer that would come into play later in the transaction is going to be seller expenses and buyer expenses and a home warranty. So basically it's pretty simple in this term, but again, it can be negotiable. The best general rule of thumb is if the expense came from when the seller owned the property, it's the seller's responsibility. If the expense is coming from the purchase of the property, it's the buyer's responsibility. For example, for a seller, some of those items can be title charges, the amount due at discharge of any liens against the property, attorney fees for preparing the deed for transfer, 1/2 of the escrow fee, government conveyance fee of transfer tax, cost of a home warranty if they opted to provide one, more often than not, the real estate commission for the agents that are involved, half closing costs, things like that. For the buyer expense, usually it's split a little bit. You have the title charges, same thing, be their half. Cost of a location survey is required, 1/2 of the escrow fee with the seller paying the other half. But any sales transaction fees and any additional, so in our purchase of a contract, it actually has 2 blanks, where at that point, a buyer and seller can negotiate. For example, if it's already known before you even make your offer that there's going to need a new septic, it's going to be $10,000 you can cover, you could actually mark in there requesting that the sellers pay for the whole thing. They could also counter back with that added and say, hey, we don't have $10,000 for it. Can we split it 50-50? So then seller expense would be 1/2 of septic replacement, buyer expense 1/2 septic replacement. Again, in order to stay competitive and make it easier, sometimes there are offers that come in where they say, hey, look, usually a seller's responsible for this. We split the closing costs, we split the escrow fee. We want this house so bad as your buyer, we're actually going to pay your closing costs to make our deal look better. With that and vice versa, the buyers can actually request that the seller pay a portion of their closing costs. Now, depending on your type of financing, there is a percentage based on the purchase price of the home and what you can and can't go over and how much assistance you can ask for as a buyer. But as a seller, if a buyer comes to you and says, hey, we're going to pay your closing costs, they can pay your closing costs. Next is a home warranty. It was the last one I mentioned. This one's pretty simple. Additional coverage on the home, usually general home cover furnace, air conditioner, hot water tank. They also cover if the appliances are left, dishwasher, washer, dryer, microwave, refrigerator, anything that's going to be left at the property that the sellers leave. During the time of inspection, if it passes and is confirmed as working, you can get an additional coverage. I like to think of it as a powertrain warranty on your car. It's just in case something breaks that you wouldn't expect to break. You don't expect to buy a house and 3 months after you buy a house, the entire furnace system catches fire and burns, and now you don't have a furnace, you don't have heat in your house. It helps cover it. This is for the uh-ohs, the big uh-ohs. It's also a negotiating point. Buyers can actually ask to have a home warranty and ask that the sellers pay for it. Sometimes the negotiation is taken right out of it, and for a seller to make their house seem more appealing compared to other houses on the market, will actually pay for a home warranty up front for the first year that the buyers are there. It's a negotiating tactic. It's a great sales tactic for both sides. Very helpful, especially if you're going to be leaving the appliances, but it is an additional cost. I've seen in the sales transactions that I've done, it's about 50-50 in times of people getting home warranty versus not having a home warranty. And I would also say in that it's also 50-50 in that the people that get those, sometimes the buyer pays for it, sometimes the seller pays for it. Really just a nice bonus. It's almost like the piece of candy that you get at Olive Garden after your dinner. Great meal, everything looks good. Just a little icing on the cake. So then the last really big item that we're going to talk about in negotiating is if you are buying an already existing investment property. So this would be a pretty big one for you guys. Say it has a tenant in it already. That actually, the funds for that can actually become negotiable in how those are paid out. An owner, buyer can request that the owner actually cut them an individual check for the security deposit and prorated rent. Say if you're closing on the 10th of the month, the owner would have to prorate. They get to keep, say for a month of May, you're closing on May 10th. The current owner of the property gets to keep the rent from the 1st to the 10th. You get the rent from May from the 11th to the 31st. All the tenant knows is he paid his rent. But it can be negotiable. Sometimes those can actually be paid in as credit, and that's actually usually the default. If there is no direct negotiation, the title company would just go ahead and credit whatever the security deposit and prorated rent is to the buyer and the portion of the rent to the seller. It could be a direct transfer. It can be included in the deal. It can be included as repair costs. Think of it as a little bit of a bonus. So if you buy a house for $100,000, they're getting $800 a month rent. The way the proration works out, you have $700. You're going to have $700 less in closing costs if you decide to just have it added to the bill. If not, you're going to close on the deal, and then you're going to get an escrow check from the disbursement from the title company. So then you physically have the check in your hand. You can go deposit it into the bank. That way you keep your security deposit separate, or you can have it on hand. I have seen it in situations where people buy a property. They're expecting that, oh, I just get the rent and the security deposit, and a week or two goes by, and they've called me as a property manager and said, hey, has your office received my security deposit and rent for the rental property I just bought? Oh, no. And I was like, well, my agent said that was included in the deal. Where's my money? And well, I'll have to explain to them that they need to look at the purchase agreement and their settlement statement with the title company. And there's a good chance that if it wasn't discussed beforehand, it was just paid in as a credit. So then rather than having a security deposit when that tenant does move out, that owner is actually going to have to write a check to refund the security deposit because they were just given it as a disbursement credit. I know that sounds like a lot. I hope that wasn't too confusing. But really the best thing to remember in real estate transactions is until there's a signature from both parties, anything is negotiable, anything. One item, I did forget one item that is not a part of our general purchase. It is something that is used very seldomly, but is a great tactic in a competitive market. If you're working with an agent, especially right now, and they don't even know what this is, you need to have a conversation with them, or maybe think about having a conversation with a different one. It is called an escalation clause. Think of it as the auto bidder for eBay. There is a clause, and as a seller, you also need to know this as well, because I have seen really good offers get turned down in the past. I was representing the buyer, but really good offers get turned down for a worse offer simply because the sellers and unfortunately the agent on the other side didn't know how to read an escalation clause. So like I said, think of it as the auto bidder in eBay. Say you have a property that's listed for $105,000. You submit a purchase price for $100,000. It goes into multiple offers. There are 5 other people bidding against you, and they're making a decision tomorrow afternoon at 3. You can either send it with the original agreement or add it after the fact while they're still in discussion. It's an escalation clause that says, hey, my initial offer is $100,000. If there is an offer on the table that is better, than is higher than mine, I will automatically match theirs plus $2,500 up to 100 and whatever you want, 115,000. So basically what you're telling them is that, hey, my initial offer is 100 because I think that's what it's worth, but I want this house so bad that I'm willing to pay up to 115 if somebody outbids me in the next 12 hours. Like I said, just like the auto bidder from eBay, it is not something that has ever been used before, or was used very seldomly. But in the last 6 to 8 months with COVID and the inventory, it is popping up all over the place. I used in 3 years that I've been doing this, about 4 months ago was the first time I used an escalation clause. And the agent on the other side, who had been doing this for 20 plus years, actually called me and asked me what the hell this document was. That's how rare it is, but it is a great negotiating tool. Even if you are representing yourself, you do have that ability to put in an escalation clause with a standard purchase contract when negotiating with sellers. And if they ever get confused about it, offer to present it to them yourself. Believe it or not, that can happen. You can go sit. I have actually presented an offer on behalf of the buyer in person to the seller. And if you don't have an agent, you're representing yourself, you can still ask that. You could ask their agent, hey, I would like you to talk to your sellers and ask if I can present this in front of them just to make sure they understand what I'm offering. One great tactic in negotiation for anybody who may be seasoned that has recently changed due to Ohio law in the past, a great heartfelt sentiment was to actually, with your purchase agreement, to kind of tug on the heartstrings a little bit, is to write a personal letter to the sellers. Hi, my name is Ben. I just graduated college 2 years ago. I've been living in an apartment. Me and my girlfriend just got engaged last month. We're looking for our first home to blah, 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 build our life, yada, yada, yada. And try to tug on the heartstrings, just make somebody smile, give them that feel-good feeling of it will make you feel good to sell your house to us. Recently, in the last couple of months, since the beginning of the year, they are now actually starting to advise against that, in that it might actually be a violation of fair housing law. Basically, in stating that if a seller picks you because of your familiar status, your gender, your religion, your personal beliefs, that is in fact a violation of fair housing. Those things cannot be taken into account when looking at tenants or people buying and selling property. So if you've ever purchased a house before, or that is something that you've heard people recommend doing, one piece of advice I'd give you moving forward, 2021, don't do it. Could set you up for some very big problems, or at the very least set the seller up for some very big problems if one of the other buyers who lost out were to find out that that was the deciding factor. To be very bad for everybody involved. So I think we've gotten in about 40 minutes. I know that was a general. I did go a little bit longer into the financing inspections than I had planned, but there's a lot of information there. could really talk for hours about different negotiating tactics. So what I want to throw it out, best I could do in 45-minute window, which is kind of give the general overview. Are there any specific questions that you guys would have in terms of different transactions, real estate, investment, commercial? Is it wholesaling, independent, for sale by owner? Is there any, I don't want to say unordinary, but any out of the box type of investing that you guys would have any questions with that I might be able to answer? And I do have the chat open too if you guys. Go ahead. Go ahead, Anthony.
Hey, Ben. Just real quick question. So on the escalation clause, I'm sorry, is that one of those things, like, let's just say that, kind of your example that you gave, the house is listed for 105. I make an offer of 100,000, or I'm sorry, 100,000, but I have it up to, I'd match any competitive offers up to 115 plus $2,500, and I present that to the seller. Is that something where they could go back potentially to like another offer and try to get more money, knowing that their offer is 100,000, but they're trying to maximize the 115?
Good, thank you. You touched on a point that I skipped over. So with an escalation clause, whether you have, so ours has it, but if you're working on your own, this is definitely something you want to add. With the escalation clause, there is a burden of proof on the seller. So say, like in my example, it was 105, you started at 100. Tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock rolls around, you get a phone call at 3:05. Hey, we've made a decision. We're going to take your offer, but it's actually at 112.5. Cool? It's not that simple, because then, yes, you're right. They could take it to other properties. They could say we have a better offer. And one thing with real estate and with real estate agents, we are bound as fiduciary agents that we cannot disclose confidential information. That includes purchase contracts. To the point of, on my own listing, if I get something under contract, I cannot discuss, even with agents in my office, how much that property is under contract for until it is sold in public knowledge. So they couldn't take your offer and basically throw it in somebody else's face and be like, hey, well, we have this thing, escalation clause. If you can go to 120, you'll beat him out. It's not in the that way. There's also a burden of proof that needs to be included. And what that means is, say they didn't make that phone call, say, hey, it's going to be 112.5. I noticed in your escalation clause, it says that we must provide you with a blacked out confidential copy of the offer that you beat. So what that means is your escalation clause goes into effect. Say they had an offer at 110, your escalation clause automatically bumped and beat that. The listing agent is obligated per your escalation clause to take the purchase offer that you beat and black out the personal information, their name, financial contact information, anything that would be considered confidential, and send that to you to be initialed to verify that, yes, there was in fact an offer for 110,000, at which point your escalation clause kicked in at 112.5. That is why your offer is what it is. Make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. Okay. Yeah.
Any other questions?
I guess I have one more. So I'm not really sure if you really touched on this or not, but I know a couple of different people that have, not really so much the past year, but I guess before the pandemic, they do a lot of like buying and really just flipping on foreclosure homes, getting them under contract, but not really having any intent on buying them themselves, turning around and finding like cash buyers to sell a property to, but they have it under contract, so it ends the negotiation of receiving other offers while they go and search for cash buyers to then buy the property and then have a couple $1,000 transaction.
So what you're describing is the foundation of wholesaling.
Okay.
So where that comes up, and sellers keep an eye out on this if you're ever selling your property, is a clause in the contract. So in that first section where I said the very first thing it's going to do is going to detail who's buying the property, who's selling the property address, all of that, just that legal information. You can add 2 words to the buyer's name that would allow them to do that. And it would be, for example, like mine is blank sellers agrees to sell and Benjamin Moody or assignable agrees to purchase upon the following terms and conditions. So what that means is for the time being, I'm buying the property, but I also am reserving the right to assign it to somebody else in the next 30 days. That's where wholesaling comes in. So they lock the property in place, they set a certain price, and then they go through their own network and say, like you said, for a couple $1,000 kick, they have the property under contract for 60. They're going to sell it to John Doe in California for 65,000. He agrees to it. He sends him the cash. He assigns the contract to John Doe, and now they've made $5,000 on the switch. The only catch with that is with a wholesaling, you have to disclose any financial gain from the assignable, and both parties have to sign it. So John Doe and whoever the original sellers are would have to receive a document that says, hey, me as Ben Moody have assigned the contract to John Doe in exchange for a $5,000 assignment fee. Sellers are good with it. New buyers good with it. Now the property can close. So that is where wholesaling gets into it, is being able to put a property under contract with maybe or maybe not having the intention to buy it up front. Part of that is going back to the earnest money. If the seller believes that you may be a wholesaler or they aren't really comfortable with the idea of wholesaling, they may say, hey, instead of a $500 earnest money deposit, we need a $2,000 earnest money deposit, and we'll let you put this under contract and go find somebody else. But if you don't, in the next 10 days, we're keeping your $2,000 whether you buy the house or not. So that's where the gamble and the risk is offset there.
Would that be why they typically would go towards foreclosing compared to just like a traditional? Because the people I've talked to, like they seem to target on foreclosures compared to, traditional listings.
That may be, that could be a possibility. Really, where you see the targeting of foreclosures or short sales, or even private selling. Have you ever seen those signs on the side of this road that say "We buy houses cash"?
Yes.
Yeah, yep. Those 9 times out of 10, those are wholesalers that are just farming for cheap below market properties.
Gotcha.
I think more often when you see that, that's giving them a negotiation tool to make a more profit. A foreclosed home is more often than not listed or sold for well below what it's actually worth. If they can find a $100,000 house that's foreclosed on for $80,000, they put it under contract for $80 and can sell it to somebody for $110. That's a much better profit for them than if they bought the house at $100 and sold it for $110. Make sense?
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. Yep.
Anybody else? No? Okay. Well, I'll tell you what, guys, it was a pleasure. I believe, I'm not sure, you have to confirm. I think that my contact information was given on the first video. I'm not sure if it'll be on this one again. If not, you're more than welcome to reach out. My email address, my work email is benmoody@kw.com. I'll go ahead and put it in the chat. If you guys ever have any real estate questions, ever like to chime in, even if it's just a basic message, thank you for putting that up there. Type faster than I can. You guys are more than welcome to reach out. I'm doing real estate. Not only am I a realtor and a property manager, I'm an investor myself. I'm open to questions. If you guys ever need any questions, or even if it's just to sit down and come up with ideas and brainstorm, I'm happy to help. It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me, everybody. Thank you for joining on. And I'll see you next time.
Have a good night.
You too.